Welcome to Sinful's Horror Stories. If you're new to my channel, please be sure to subscribe now for future content. And if you're returning, please leave a like on this video as it helps perform at a much higher rate. Tonight's video features gruesome and macabre crimes committed in cemeteries. I want everyone to sit back, relax, enjoy this new theme, and stay sinful. Two cannibal brothers robbed more than 100 graves. Pakistani brothers Muhammad Arif and Farman Ali were arrested for a second time in 2014 for their unique hobby of stealing and eating human corpses. After neighbors complained of a horrible stench coming from their residence, police found the severed head of a boy, as well as other body parts stewing in a pot. Arif and Ali were originally arrested in 2011 for snatching bodies and body parts from more than 100 graves to satiate themselves. Since Pakistan has no laws against cannibalism, the brothers only served 2 years for dehumanizing a body. As far as serial killers go, Ed Gein has to be one of the absolute creepiest. Gein didn't kill many people, but he was known to steal bodies from the graveyard. Why? He was building a suit of human flesh, as well as decorating everything in his house with bones and skin. Gein started robbing graves before he was eventually arrested for the murder of a local woman. Upon searching his house on an isolated farm, police found human flesh to be the centerpiece of Gein's interior decorating, in addition to the furniture and fixtures made out of body parts. He was fashioning a suit made of female skin that he could wear around while pretending to be his dead mother. Sounds a little bit like the movie Psycho, if you ask me. Norman Bates, anyone? In a case almost as bizarre as pet cemeteries themselves, Brandon Nodier pled guilty to the murder of heiress Dorothy Thompson in 2014 after the case went cold for 30 years. Nodier started working as a live-in caretaker for Thompson's New Orleans pet cemetery in 1980. Known around town as a con artist, Nodier convinced Thompson, a heavy drug user, to give him a 99-year lease on the property for a mere $20 a month. In 1984, Thompson came to her senses and accused Nodier of tricking her and filed a civil suit against him. Before the case could be resolved, her body was found chained up with a plastic bag over her head in the Mississippi River. The case went cold only until a witness came forward. He told police he spoke to Nodier, who confessed the crime to him. When he realized the police were on his trail, Nodier panicked and began to threaten another key witness, who also worked at the cemetery and had witnessed him strangling Thompson. Nodier was able to plead guilty of manslaughter in 2014 and received only 10 years in prison. 2 months after Charlie Chaplin's death in 1977, his body was stolen from a Swiss cemetery. The culprit soon contacted Chaplin's widow, Ona Chaplin, seeking $600,000 for the return of the legend's body. Ona refused to pay the ransom because she believed her husband would have thought the demand was outrageous. Police started investigating the case, and 5 months later, 2 auto mechanics were arrested for the theft. They temporarily buried Chaplin's body in a cornfield while trying to collect the money. He was exhumed and returned to a safeguarded concrete tomb. The unsolved case made headlines for 18 years. Jessica Lynn Keene, a pretty high school cheerleader, was found dead in Foster Chapel Cemetery in West Jefferson, Ohio. Keene had been staying at a safe house for troubled teens and runaways after arguing with her mother. One night she was kidnapped, raped, and murdered, but the police were unable to find her killer. That is until convict Marvin Lee Smith gave a DNA sample from jail for an unrelated charge that connected him to the murders. Authorities later learned that in 1991, Smith snatched Keene from a bus stop. She managed to get away from him into a nearby cemetery, but ended up running into a fence post. Smith caught up with her and bludgeoned her with a 70-pound headstone that he pulled out of the ground. he was sentenced to 30 years to life in 2009. Back in the 19th century, body snatching was a common crime among medical students. Doctors were expected to have extensive knowledge of the human body for surgery, yet there were very few specimens. Partly because donating your body to science wasn't quite a thing yet, which left medical students in a bit of a predicament. One such snatched body belonged to politician John Scott Harrison, son of President William Henry Harrison and father to future President Benjamin Harrison. On the day of his funeral in 1878, mourners noticed the nearby grave of a man named Augustus Devon had been emptied. One of Harrison's sons, a friend of Devon's, went searching for the body at Cincinnati medical schools. Instead, he found his father's naked body hanging by a rope in a chute. Devon's body was later found in a vat of brine at the University of Michigan. What do you do when you're the nighttime caretaker of a dark, expansive cemetery? You deal drugs, of course. Omar Cruz was a caretaker of Woodland Cemetery in Stamford, Connecticut, when police started getting suspicious of him. After getting a tip he was dealing drugs, police started tailing him. When they couldn't find any drugs at his apartment, they figured the only place he had unrestricted access to was a graveyard. Using their drug-sniffing dog Titan, who found 10.6 grams of cocaine hidden inside a commercial-sized lawnmower on the cemetery grounds. In June of 2015, 14-year-old Jordan Watson became the target of 3 vicious bullies. Watson was dating a girl, also 14, when 19-year-old George Thompson became jealous. Despite the two being friends, Thompson lured Watson to a cemetery in Carlisle, England, and stabbed him to death. According to authorities, Thompson told Watson he wanted his help in a money-making scheme, but he's really after Watson's girlfriend. Thompson enlisted the help of 2 other men who owed him, and the gang murdered the unsuspecting Watson. Thompson will serve a minimum of 27 years, while the 2 accomplices will serve a minimum of 14 years and 10 years respectively. Rather than heading to Crate and Barrel like a normal person, this lady in West Virginia decided to decorate her backyard with stolen grave markers. Penny Snodgrass stole a set of family headstones out of the Brownland Cemetery to line her burn pit and decorate her driveway. Police could see the headstones just from driving by her backyard and charged her with grand larceny. To add insult to injury, the gravestones belonged to decorated veterans from the community. Back in 1982, famous punk band The Misfits were arrested, along with 14 fans for trespassing in a New Orleans cemetery. Apparently, the Misfits hoped to check out the famous above-ground New Orleans graves, particularly that of voodoo queen Mary Laveau. A couple of local teens they befriended agreed to take them out one night, but word spread and it soon was a group of 30 kids drinking and hollering in the cemetery. Someone reported them and the famous band members were arrested, full makeup and all, for trespassing. I was originally hired because the cemetery had a period of time where they experienced people sneaking in to perform rituals. I was 21 years old doing this as a side job, with nothing to protect myself. I was given a barcode scanner and was told to drive through the entire cemetery every hour or so to patrol and to scan each of the pre-posted barcodes to prove I was actually doing it. Now this cemetery was massive, pretty much broken into 3 parts: the newer part, the historic part, and the famous part where celebrities are buried. I did this routine once and never did it again, going so far as to break the barcode scanner so I didn't have to. While I was driving, it was pitch black. Coming around a long curved road, my headlights picked up what I could have sworn were a pair of legs walking across the path, but only up to the knees. Shoes, pants, knees, then absolutely nothing. I stopped on the road and just watched this pair of legs cross 10 feet in front of me. I put the car in reverse, did what felt like the longest K-turn of my life, and noped it straight back to the parking lot. Thank you guys for watching and listening to the very end. If you want your story featured on an upcoming video, please be sure to email the email in the description box below. And until we meet again, stay sinful.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Best Fiends a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, you guys probably know by now that I'm a big fan of Best Fiends, and as you guys also know, true crime and horror is another one of my passions. But even I need the occasional break. So when I feel like I need a bit of a mental palate cleanser, my go-to refresher is Best Fiends. With Best Fiends, you play through an actual storyline, which helps with that satisfying feeling of progression. It's also an awesome brain-boosting puzzle game that is great for downtime. I personally like playing it when I'm on a long trip somewhere, stuck on a train or in a car or something. Best Fiends is now also my go-to game at night when I'm just chilling in bed and can't sleep. And not to brag, but I'm over 1,000 levels in now and I still can't put the game down. In fact, 30 minutes can feel a lot like 30 seconds with how much fun I'm having. There are tons of levels with new challenges coming online all the time, and with literally thousands of levels to chew through, there is always something new to do. I also love that I can play it literally anywhere I want without having to worry about using data or finding Wi-Fi, so even when I don't have the internet for whatever reason, I still have a fresh challenge waiting for me to give me that mental pick-me-up. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. So, the village that I lived in was only about maybe 40 to 50 people at most living there. Everyone knew everyone. All 12 of us kids knew each other too and played with each other. And naturally, some of us grouped together and explored the surrounding area since there wasn't much in the way of entertainment back then, mid to late 90s, in rural Ohio, that is. The village was old. The furthest back that I could find about the village documentation-wise was that it was established back in late 1790s or something as a small trading hub for the local area. Ohio didn't actually become a state until 1803. My village had a single church in the center of it, an old schoolhouse converted into an actual house just next to it, and pasture behind it with thick woods surrounding like 3 of the 4 sides of the small town. My dad grew up around the area, so he was full of legends and stories about the area. One of those stories was about a small fort that was originally French, turned British, and finally colonial American in the area. Nobody really knew exactly where it was located, but there was a few mentions of a small fort in the area from the research that I'd done. Now, one of the stories about this fort was that it was a primary trade route for the local native tribes, and the influx of settlers that were arriving in the area. Naturally, conflicts arose as more and more people settled the surrounding area, and eventually, all that conflict ensued between the settlers and the native tribes. The fort was said to be destroyed by fire, people on both sides slaughtered each other, and eventually the natives were driven from the area with the help of a local militia. My dad always told me the land wasn't good, tainted in ways with bad energy, and I guess when entire families are slaughtered and people being driven away from their homeland, it can cause some long-term ill effects. Anyway, when all of us kids were playing, we were always told 2 things. 1, if the woods get quiet, you get quiet and leave immediately. And 2, if your name is being called out and you're way out in the woods, do not respond. Go home immediately and never look back. Pretend that you never even heard it to begin with. Everyone in the village knew how quirky the area was. Most days were the usual bland days, while some days it was like a fairy tale, I guess. Periodically other days it could be a nightmare. The people of the woods were probably the most common entity everyone in the village knew of, and were generally treated with respect and a wide berth. But some of the other things were, well, generally best left well alone entirely. So, now, on to my experience. In the late 90s, I was around 10 years old when I was overcome with an insatiable desire to go camping. It was mid-August, so hot and muggy during the day, but pretty cool and mild at night. I gathered two of my friends and told them about it, and they both liked the idea. Now, generally, nobody really camped in our woods. My parents, along with many others, really didn't like the idea of a group of 10 or 11-year-olds going camping alone. My dad said that we could as long as he came with us just to ensure that we were safe, and I reluctantly agreed. Prior to that night, I went out to scout out a good area to make camp at, and I knew of a fairly decent place that was close to the creek, relatively flat and not difficult to get to. I wanted to scout the area just to ensure that it was cleared of debris and ready for tents. By this time, I was well acquainted with the people of the woods, and I made my offering before entering the woods. I didn't see them while on my journey or anything, so I felt pretty good about that. Once I arrived at the location, I began moving things around, clearing out the sticks, large stones, and making a fire pit. Even going as far as stocking it with wood and throwing some larger sticks nearby for fuel for later. I was so enthralled in what I was doing and so focused on getting the area cleared that by the time that I was satisfied with what I had done, I just noticed just how quiet everything around me became. When I say quiet too, I mean like completely dead silent. No birds, bugs, not even the wind made a noise amongst the leaf litter. I immediately shut down everything that I was doing. I stood there looking around, slowing my breathing, and just trying to listen for the faintest sound that I could. I don't know how long I stood there, motionless. Maybe a few minutes. Maybe. But then, in the far distance, I could hear a crow call, and almost immediately I began hearing the chirping of robins, and even a faint whistling from the wind in the trees. I really don't know why, but the hair on my arms and neck were on end, and I figured, well, maybe it was just me making a ruckus that everything nearby quieted down because of that. Content with that logical reasoning, I began making my way back home, up for the night. And around 6 p.m. that night, my two friends made their way over with their backpacks, tents, and both me and my dad were finishing up dinner. All four of us made ready with everything that we needed and began trekking out to the site that I'd prepared. Nothing all that noteworthy happened going to the site, even after setting up our tents, lighting the fire, and making s'mores. It was shaping up to be a pretty fun night, really, and rather enjoyable. Once we started to get ready to crawl into our tents for the night, around 10 or 11 p.m., the wind started to pick up, and my dad said that we might be in for some rain, but he didn't seem to have a look of contentment. My dad loved the rain on his face when he said it. It was like, I don't know, he felt something was off or something. And it wasn't long that all of us started to feel that way too. We all sort of ended up crawling into our tents anyway, since it was nighttime, and with possible rain incoming, trekking back home would have really sucked. But honestly, we should have walked back. We situated our tents in a sort of half circle around the fire pit, which all were facing the creek and the back of the tents facing the wood line. My dad was to the left of me in his military surplus tent, and me in my cheapo Walmart single-person tent, just barely large enough for me, and my two friends to my right in their own tents. The wind was howling for some time, half an hour to an hour before it calmed down, and then it got quiet. No crickets, no wind, no wildlife at all. The creek itself, which usually bubbles happily along, sounded muted all of a sudden. All we had at that time was the faint glow of embers from the fire pit in front of our tents casting a warm glow. I began to hear my heart throbbing in my ears, and I knew that my dad and my two friends were just as anxious as I was, as I could hear them sort of shifting uncomfortably. I heard one of my friends' tent zipper, and naturally I undid my zipper too to see what was going on. And as soon as I popped my head out to look, I saw my dad come out of his tent with a machete that he had, and he faced the wood line. My friend had his head poking out too, and asked if I heard what that noise was. I didn't hear anything, but my heart was pounding so hard that it was hard hearing him even whisper. We both partially got out of the tent to see what my dad was looking at, but all we could see was like inky darkness, and It was then that I heard it. A distant and faint hello. It was coming from some ways away in the darkness of the woods. I could see my dad shift uncomfortably on his feet, white-knuckling his machete, looking into the woodline. Then again, a voice called out, hello, but it just didn't seem right. It was off-putting, almost as if whoever was speaking was trying to speak in a very feminine voice, faint and fragile. My dad motioned me to grab some of the extra wood next to his tent and throw it on the fire, which I reluctantly did. Leaving the perceived safety of my tent didn't sit well with me. As the fire began to slowly grow in brightness, my dad stepped backwards near the fire and stood there facing the woodline. By this time, my other friend popped his head out of his tent too, and all three of us, including my dad, were just watching the woodline, unsure what to expect. Nothing came out, and we didn't hear the voice again. An hour passed, and by this time my dad was sitting on a large stone next to his tent, one leg crossed and a machete in his right hand, watching silently, only the sound of crackling fire echoing against the shale cliff face across the creek. Several hours passed, and both my friends went back into their tents. Only me and my dad were out, me tending the fire and my dad watching and waiting. I could hear rustling to our right, just beyond the light from the fire and the tree line. My friend closest to it popped his head out, looked at me and asked, "What?" as if he was wanting me to repeat what I said. Mind you, I didn't say a word. I hadn't said a word since I came out of my tent the first time, in fact. I put my finger up to my lips and motioned to be quiet. By the time that I did this, my dad was standing next to me and told us both to shush, and immediately we heard someone say, "Come here," in the same off-putting feminine voice as earlier. All three of us stood there, peering into the direction of where the voice come from, and shortly after we heard what sounded like something move back deeper into the woods. It didn't sound heavy, it sounded like something sort of lightly trotting back into the woods. And that was the last time that we heard it. Shortly after, I'm assuming early morning, just before daybreak that is, the wood life returned, crickets, the distant chirp of the birds, and the whisper from the wind through the leaves, everything. Once daybreak came, we all broke our tents down and we packed up and began hiking back home quick smart. We were paranoid the entire way back, stopping, listening, and looking. We didn't see or hear anything or anyone. Nobody said a word on the way back, in fact. But once we made it back to my backyard, my dad broke the silence and told us that what we had just experienced never happened, and it would do us good to not say a word to anyone about it. He had fear written all over his face, as if not even he had experienced something like that before. To this day, I really don't know what it was, or perhaps who it was. I did at one point end up asking my aunt next door later in life if she'd experienced something similar, since she grew up in the area too, but even she was really tight-lipped about it, saying that we shouldn't have gone camping out there and my dad was a fool for letting us go. I have since left my village and I've moved out of state, and I have run into similar stories down here in the southeast with the same reluctance to explain what it was or could be. I really don't know why people are so afraid to talk about it, but if any of you guys can enlighten me, then I'm really all ears at this point, because I would like to know what the heck happened that night. So, there are a couple of incidences leading up to the not-so-imaginary friend that I'll talk about first, because I think they might be related. When my son was a baby, one of his first words was Guy. He would say Mama, Daddy, and Guy. He was seeing something that we couldn't see, and he called it Guy. For example, he would point to the corner of the room and say, "Guy." never scared, but sort of excited when he would point to him. Sometimes he would wave at him and giggle. Being who we are, we just assumed that he was seeing something spiritual. At the time, Guy never caused us any issues, and my son didn't seem afraid. Time went on, and as my son got older and could speak a little better, he told me that he wanted Guy to leave. And to be honest, he seemed a little bit uneasy. We were in my bedroom, and I was holding my son on my hip. My son pointed to the corner of the room to let me know that Guy was there. I said to Guy in a firm voice, feeling a little bit silly to be honest, "Guy, it's time for you to leave our house. Please move on in peace, but you're not welcome here anymore." But before I could finish speaking, my son let out a deafening scream, buried his face in my shoulder and cried, "Run, run, run, Mummy, run." He was crying and terrified. Super startled too. I just embraced my son and I ran out of the room. I tried not to show my fear. I wanted to be brave for my son, but to be honest, it really rattled me. I don't know what he saw that day. I can only really imagine. His reaction was just so intense. I asked, but he just refused to talk about it. Whatever it was, though, it was real to him and extremely scary for both of us. And it was from this point forward that my son had problems sleeping at night, scared of the dark, started walking in his sleep and just very jumpy. He never spoke of Guy again, but we did have other stuff sort of happen. We experienced lots of activity, I guess you could call it, in that house, like shadow figures, lights turning on, disembodied voices, items falling off of tables on their own, etc. One particular light, in fact, that would turn on randomly was in my son's closet. I never told anyone about the light, but one night my sister was babysitting my son, and she says to me nervously, "What's up with your child's closet? It's creepy in there, and I swear the light keeps turning on." Fast forward though, my son is 4 years old now and starts interacting with something that I can't see again. Some might say an imaginary friend. He would talk to him when he was playing alone and would stop talking when I entered the room. This went on for a couple of weeks, and whenever I would ask about his friend, he would sort of shy away from it. He didn't really want to talk about it. Eventually my son told me that this friend was sad because his family was far away and that's why he was staying with us now. I asked if this friend had a name, and my son says, yeah, he's a kid and his name is Godmo. I was expecting to hear a common name like John or something. I thought to myself, well, that's a really strange name, and I sort of felt a little bit anxious about it, if I'm being honest. Realizing, though, that my son was ready to talk about his friend, I would ask him questions about Godmo during normal conversation. I never pressed him for too much information because I didn't want him to stop talking to me about it. But my son tells me, though, that Godmo comes and goes through our mirrors. And man, do I get goosebumps just thinking about that. Mirrors? Like mirrors? According to my son, he enters our home through the mirror above my bed and exits through the bathroom mirror. That was really elaborate info for a 4-year-old, and now I'm starting to feel, well, quite uneasy about this Godmo. I started researching mirrors and spirits, and I quickly find out that maybe I should remove the mirror above my bed. Apparently, we are most vulnerable when we're sleeping, and a mirror could act as a doorway. Anyway, days go by and the activity in our home ramps up. One example, for instance, was that after putting my son to bed, I heard things being moved in his room, and it sounded a lot like someone digging around in a toy box. I get up and go back into his room thinking that my son was awake. I see that his bedroom light is on. I walk into the room ready to tell him to get back into bed, and he was completely sound asleep. Not only was he sound asleep too, but he was perfectly tucked in and not one blanket had been moved. It was clear to me that he had not been out of bed. And I know what I heard, and I have no clue how or why his light is on. The next morning, I asked my son if he turned his light on last night, knowing that he didn't, but I had to ask anyway. And he says to me, no, but Godmo turns on the lights because he doesn't like the dark. I asked him if Godmo scares him sometimes, and to my surprise he said yes, when he gets angry. Oh, and he does not like you, Mum. Angry? And he doesn't like me? At this point, I'm pretty much done with Godmo. Concerned for my baby, I spoke to my sister about everything, and she agreed that she didn't feel good about it either. It's creepy, right? I always trust my first instinct. So, could this Godmo be something sinister? Could it be posing as a little kid but actually be something else? Something dark and evil? All things considered, I didn't know for certain, but I felt concerned and I was worried about my 4-year-old. I mean, even the name Godmo alone was really weird to me. So I decided that it was time to do something. In the end, I decided upon a major spiritual cleanse in my home. I sage, white sage, randomly, but this time I was more thorough, more serious and focused. At the time, I thought that this was best to do this when my son wasn't at home. Although I am spiritual, open-minded, and believe in the paranormal, I don't push my beliefs and practices on my kids. So he was unaware of what I was doing. Lots of praying, sage, calling on angels for protection, candles, you name it. I also removed that mirror from my bedroom, and the activity settles. Approximately 3 weeks later, I think, my son comes to me very upset though, still unaware of the cleanse, and he tells me that he wants Godmo back. Please bring him back. I told him that Godmo returned to his family, not knowing how to explain these things that I don't even fully understand myself to a 4-year-old. But that for me confirmed that there was something very real and very strange going on. I mean, like I said, my 4-year-old wasn't there and I did all this stuff quietly and alone. So how he knew that Godmo was supposed to be gone at this stage, well, I can only put that down to the fact that whatever this thing was had actually been removed. When I would discuss this with close family, I felt like I needed to be cautious about saying Godmo out loud. His name makes me nervous, and I just didn't want Godmo to return. My inner voice is telling me not to repeat his name. I can't explain why, but it's just how I feel, and even now, I don't like sharing it. Years later, though, in a different home, my son, 7 years old at the time, started seeing a dark shadow in the hallway where I had hung the old bedroom mirror in our house. And it was at that point that I trashed that mirror. I don't know if the shadow was connected to his previous experience, but either way, I decided to get rid of that mirror. We still have activity, but nothing that really concerns me anymore. Nothing too heavy. Overall, we have more positive experiences than negative ones, to be honest. But, yeah, Godmo, that's an experience that I'll never forget. This happened on New Year's Eve day of 2019 to 2020. I was celebrating the end of another year at my house with 3 of my friends. My dad was out at a friend's party for New Year's, and my younger sister was at a sleepover as well. Now, we were in the living room just waiting for the cookies that we'd baked to be ready, eating the raw leftover cookie dough. We were watching Netflix, Castlevania Season 2 if anyone cared. But being teenage girls with no cooking skills for anything but pastries, we had ordered a ton of pizza and fast food from the local pizza shop. So when someone knocked at the door, we originally thought nothing of it. I mumbled a comment about delivery people not knowing what a doorbell was, and got up pausing the TV and paid the delivery guy. I went back to my friends and we started to dig in, still watching the TV, and then this is the moment that I don't think that I could forget, even if I wanted to. The door to the living room was shut and the curtains were closed, TV at near full volume. We were all intently focused on the season's finale episode, either throwing comments out at the TV or just sounds of surprise. This began just as the final fight of the season started. My best friend Ali had just shouted, "He can turn into a wolf?" At the same time that an aggressive bang came to the door, but we didn't fully register it because of Ali shouting and the loud soundtrack. I paused the TV, waiting a minute, when another bang came to the door. I got up curious who it could be. I mean, no one should have been coming to the door at this point. I stuck my head out of the living room, seeing a man just standing at the door. Because I'm a teenage girl, home with only 2 other teenagers, I obviously didn't answer, but just stood by the doorway, able to watch him to make sure that he left. He didn't. He banged on the door rhythmically. My friends and me are different people. I'm very paranoid and organized, whereas they are more relaxed, and they told me to sit back down and that he would leave. But then the door handle shook aggressively. "Call the police," I said quickly. My phone was upstairs in my room charging, so Ali called 999. She was speaking with the operator when just everything seemed to slow down. The man had thrown a rock at the window in our door, and the key was in the lock to get in and out, and I'd have to go towards him if I wanted to stop it. The police told us to find a place to hide with a lock on it, but there was no room with a lock. The bolt on the bathroom door had been broken since we had moved in, but never had a reason to be fixed. So we ran out of the living room into the kitchen, and I had 2 ideas. One, get a knife in case I had to defend myself, or at least just threaten him. 2, get out Storm. Storm was my dad's dog, and he was a security and ex-police dog, so I grabbed his lead, got him out of his dog cage, and clipped on the lead, grabbing a kitchen knife. I then went into the backyard with my friends. The man opened the door to the yard where we all stood, and I desperately tried not to look scared, but this man had to be about 40, long greasy blonde hair and blank blue eyes. They seemed to not give any emotion behind them, but his mouth was in a sort of twisted grin, and he was also holding some sort of a knife, maybe a hunter's knife or something. Storm was barking loudly at him, but the man didn't falter. I was hesitant to let Storm off because I didn't want Storm to get hurt. I said to him, "Come closer and I'll let him off." But he just kept walking. I backed away, standing next to my friends. "The second that I let Storm off, we get the knife, all right?" I whispered, and my friends nodded. Ali still had the operator on the phone, who said anything that we did could be classed as self-defense. So I ordered Storm to go and let him off the lead. Storm lunged at this guy, knocking him backwards, causing the knife to drop out, but not too far away. Storm had a tight grip on his arm, though, so I ran over, kicking the knife away from him. This went on for maybe 10 or 20 minutes when the police finally came, and I got Storm off of him, and my dad was called and came straight home to make sure that we were okay, which we were, luckily. But my dad, he later found out that this guy was actually a convicted sex offender who had moved in 2 streets down and saw me walking Storm and our other dog too. All I can say is, man, am I so grateful that we have Storm and that my dad taught me how to deal with difficult and dangerous situations, because I don't know what would have happened if we had just sat there watching TV. So my friend and I, we decided to drive from Philadelphia to Miami Beach. Unfortunately, though, the car's block cracked in North Carolina. This was around 1975, although I could be off by 14 months or so, I guess. But I thought that it would be a bit of an adventure to sort of hitchhike the rest of the way. I remember waiting all night on a god-forsaken stretch of highway in North Carolina. We got a 10-mile ride from some guy with a Prince Valiant haircut, who upon dropping us said, "I'll probably see you guys in the morning on my way to work." 9 hours later, sure enough, he picked us up in a station wagon filled with vending machine sandwiches. We finally got to the area around the border with South Carolina. That's when a guy, the spitting image of Bundy in retrospect, stopped and asked us where we were going. When I said Miami, he said, "What street?" We were overjoyed that this young guy, older than us, was going to take us straight to my mother's house in Bay Harbor. Now, I can't prove that this person was actually Ted Bundy, but what happened was creepy, and I've researched a little and found this happened at the time after Bundy's prison break in Colorado, and at the same time that he was supposed to have moved into Florida. Anyway, after we got in the car, he offered us a joint. He didn't want to have any, but told us to toke up. Well, whatever was in that joint was powerful enough to almost paralyze both of us. He then began to start playing with the buttons on the radio, switching the stations compulsively almost every few seconds. And I began to feel paranoid because I could sense some weirdness exuding from this guy. I was in the front seat and my friend was in the back. We went to a rest stop and he just disappeared into the bathroom for about an hour. When he finally got back into the car, he said that he had to detour to his bank and he started to take us through miles of small roads in Georgia. I remember seeing houses on stilts in marshland, but he finally stopped in the most remote location where there was a single building that looked like an abandoned tavern, maybe? We were still stoned, and he got out of the car and went behind this building. I remember seeing palm trees, I think, and was so shocked that palm trees were so far north in Georgia. Anyway, he got back into the car and had these sunglasses on, and I noticed that he seemed short as he walked back to the car. He said that he had to now speak with his lawyer and began to talk about real estate law and the changes in the law that would allow development in this area. And we drove for hours and hours until we got to Jacksonville. He pulled a car over on a strip mall-like area and told us that there was a change of plans, that we had to get out of here. We were exhausted and hungover from the angel dust or whatever was in that joint. We saw a bus station and took a bus the rest of the way to Miami. As I think back on this, though, I am almost certain that this man was Ted Bundy. I still see his face, and man, he looked a lot like him, and the time frame and the location were right too. We were two men, so I don't think that we were in danger, unless Bundy was considering killing men at some stage. I think that maybe he was just enjoying messing with us. I don't know, but that's what happened, and I'm pretty sure that I met Ted Bundy. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area a good ways outside of the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. But my father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think. It was down outside of that area and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought that he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us some quality father-son time, you know? Anyway, I remember the drive down there from Dallas was, well, pretty much torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy and I just hated it. But all I had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something that I was actually never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive obviously took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of my land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin and the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends anyway. So needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. After unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough too. Dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember it looked like some raccoons had gotten in and they'd maybe done something to the floor. But after cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots that we decided to sleep on, something about that night was just weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I just had this feeling of being watched. Eventually, though, I was finally able to drift off for what I guess was about an hour, maybe. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 in the morning, I think. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and it was horribly hot in the afternoon, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they'd been rooting around, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees, though. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there, not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. But the person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters, this is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We must have been about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked like to be ski pants. Now, this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were in the back of the cabin. We approached the person's right side and then my dad told me to stay about 20 yards away. I stayed, crouched down, watched him circle around to the front of the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a really confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes that it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than maybe a day at most. But at that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him getting worried. Almost immediately, too, after that, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I was pretty close to tears at this point. I remember feeling suddenly just really scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but it was probably only about 45 minutes max. But after returning, we packed up and we just left. We drove back home that day and we didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was just as confused as we were. He said that he would go and check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had any issues with people because his property was high fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, mind you, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there that we didn't know about, he decides to be cautious and we just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked a little bit and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought that I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found a trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. This story, it still makes my hair stand on end though. I have no idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks that maybe it was some kind of a trap or something. It's definitely not the weirdest thing that I've ever encountered in the woods, but it's a top 3 for sure. And it's something that I guess will just remain a mystery. This happened to my buddy and me when I was at college during the winter of 2010. I was and still am an outdoorsy guy who has been at home in the woods for a very long time now. I've seen and heard a lot of things, but never had an experience like this, let me tell you. So I met my buddy at college that first semester, and we became fast friends. But before I knew it, he was inviting me back to his family's place that winter to stay there and do a bit of hog hunting. I've hunted hogs since I was old enough to hunt, so I jumped at the chance. We got to his parents' place, and man, was it beautiful. They own about 1,500 acres out in rural West Texas. His family raise, show, and sell cattle and are absolutely loaded. They're amazing people, and they kind of took me in like a second son, to be honest. Over my time at college, I was visiting them a lot. But since this family is avid hunters and the land that they live on is mainly for cattle, they own another 1,000 acres that they lease to hunters and also use themselves to hunt on. So, after a day or two at the primary ranch, we set out to the hunting lease. It was just my buddy and myself. No hunters had leased it that winter yet. We set our stuff up at the little hunting cabin that they had, and we set our alarms to wake us up at 6 in the morning. We got some rest, and we woke up ready to get out to the stand. Us being wild college kids, we brought the whiskey and the coke and our rifles. Spare me the lectures. We were stupid college kids, I know. We got to the stand, though, after a short hike through the cold and hopped up onto the stand. It was one of those big green metal stands that's elevated about 15 to 20 feet in the air. The area that it was set up facing was perfect, but to the left about 100 yards was mostly cliché rock clearing with trees lining it and dead cactus. In front of us was a wider clearing with sparse trees and various weeds and grass, and to the right was a decently dense patch of trees. Behind us was a dense patch of trees and a high fence about 30 yards back. We couldn't really see behind us though, because the blind that he had was only 180 degrees view. Just a back wall and a door with a window that was boarded up because the glass or whatever it had was broken. But anyway, we just set up the chairs, started drinking, and the waiting began. We had a beautiful view of the area, and the sunrise coming from the east of where we were was just gorgeous. We didn't see anything for the first hour or so, I think, so we just kept drinking and chatting. I would guess maybe about an after the sun had rose, we started hearing some limbs breaking and brush rustling from behind us. It sounded a good ways back, maybe 50 yards or more, so we readied our rifles hoping that what we were certain were hogs would circle around. I remember just sitting there waiting, watching the fog from my breath for a good 5 minutes. The rustling got closer. Then I noticed a really metallic smell. The best way that I can describe it is almost the smell of rusty tools that they give off when you don't take care of them. They're kind of like a mix of copper, vomit, and I guess poop. I looked at my bud and whispered, "You smell that?" And he nodded and shrugged his shoulders. A minute later, we're still waiting. The rustling seems to get closer. Then it just kind of stopped. After a couple of minutes, I could still smell this stink, but no noise, and figured maybe a couple of hogs had taken a dump near the stand and moved on. I reached to pick up the bottle as my buddy puts his rifle down, and just as we're doing that, we hear a sort of scream or a grunt. Now, I have never heard anything like this. It was like a low grunt that escalated into a gravelly scream, and it sounded like it was right outside the back of the blind. But before we could even really react, we heard a bunch of twigs and branches snap. Sounded like it was right outside the back of the blind. And not even a couple of seconds after, we feel the entire blind shake about 3 times, as if a car had run into it or something. I dropped the bottle of whiskey and just looked at my friend, and he looked just as freaked as I felt. But we heard a loud, sort of singular grunt, and then the sound of twigs and branches breaking again, slowly getting quieter. We just sat there, too freaked out to move for what felt like an hour, but it was probably about 10 minutes, I think. I don't know if it was the whiskey or just me trying to be brave, but I got up eventually and opened the door, and nothing was there. We climbed down, and we had our rifles at the ready. We both knew that it wasn't a hog, but tried to convince ourselves that maybe it was. We could see the old stand marks on the ground, and the whole stand had rocked maybe about 6 inches. There was even a bent portion of one of the metal struts and 2 big depressions where it looked like feet had dug into the rocky ground. We figured that whatever it was must have stood there while it was rocking the stand. We stood there just looking dumbfounded, and we decided at that point that it was high time to get out of there. We drove back to his main house, and we told his dad. He said to just stay at their house with them for the night, and we would go check it out tomorrow. When we got there the day after, we saw the same things that were there the day prior, and his dad was super confused. I don't think that he initially believed us, to be honest, when we told him about what had happened. We found where whatever it was had come from. There was a clear path in the grass leading away from the stand, where it had been depressed and you could see sort of tree limbs broken. The highest one that was broken off was about 7 feet off the ground, I would say. We walked back 30 yards to the high fence that was there, and sure enough, about a 4-foot wide section had been mangled and bent down. His dad was really ticked off, obviously, but he was also really confused. He told us that he had never had this happen before, and he reckons that it was just a giant hog, but I never thought so. Now, I don't want to say that it was Bigfoot, but I've never had an explanation as to what could have caused that. Over the years, I've grown to believe in Bigfoot more and more. My dad had an encounter with what he claims could have been Bigfoot as well, so I don't know. But maybe it runs in the family? In any case, anything that can mangle a fence like that and move a blind like 6 inches within the ground like that, it had to have been a heck of a strong creature. This happened in the late 70s, as far as my dad can remember. It was around 78 or 79 when he was a teen out hunting in the woods with his friend. And this was a ways outside of Meridian, Texas, on a fall evening. So my father and his friend spent a lot of time messing around in the woods doing typical teen stuff, firing off bottle rockets, hunting raccoons, underage drinking sometimes. But this day they were going hunting for squirrels, so when they set out, my dad grabbed his .22 rifle. It was just a Ruger or something, with a cheap scope on it. His friend had a really nice Weimaraner that wasn't scared of anything. He would run up to bulls and chase them, he would get in scraps with bobcats, and he would chase off raccoons. He was walking along with them in the woods that day, and he said that there was an old creek bed that they would always go mess around in, so that's where they started. The walls of the creek bed were about 5 to 6 feet high, so they hopped down it and casually walked along, half-heartedly looking at the trees and such, when all of a sudden my dad said that the Weimaraner started whimpering and wouldn't come any further. It hung back about 10 feet from them, refusing to continue no matter what they said. A few seconds later, he said that it just tucked its tail and ran off back into the direction of the house. This obviously made them confused, but they just shrugged it off. They took a couple of steps further, and he said that up ahead, about 60 yards, the creek took a hard right turn and elevated up on the banks were some trees. Now, the sun was setting behind the trees, and beyond those couple of trees was open field. So, you could see the sun setting relatively clearly where they were, and his friend stopped him and said, "Hey, do you see that?" Man pointed in the direction of one of the trees. My dad said that he could see the outline of something big and seemingly hairy behind the tree peeking out at them. They weren't sure what it was at first, so they called out, "Hey, we're just hunting. Are we cool?" But there was no response or movement. My dad thought that maybe it was some sort of a huge porcupine or something, not totally uncommon in this area. So he held up his rifle and looked through the scope to try and figure out what it was. Since the sun was setting behind whatever it was hard for him to see any detail due to the sunlight. But my dad told me that what he could see really freaked him out. He said that all that he could make out was a large black fur-covered head and shoulder sort of peeking out. As he was looking at it, what he described as a huge monkey-like hand grabbed the tree trunk. My dad froze, and my dad instantly froze, and his friend asked him what he saw. My dad just shook his head and handed his buddy the rifle. His friend saw it too and was freaked out equally. They sat there for a minute, just staring at it, both of them and whatever this creature was not moving. My dad has always said that he didn't know what came over him, maybe just his teenage hubris, but he suggested that they should go and check it out. Both he and his friend clambered up the left side of the embankment, and when they got to the top, the creature had ducked back behind the tree. They slowly approached and circled around the tree, my dad keeping the rifle handy. He always said, though, that he didn't know why, because the small size of the caliber wouldn't have done much of anything against something that big. They both circled around the tree, and it turned out that when they got there was nothing there. It was just gone. They didn't know where something that big could have run off to in that short of amount of time without them even seeing it, but nonetheless, they checked the area just to see if they could find any sign of what it was. And it turns out that they found two depressions where it would have been standing, but due to the fall leaf litter, there wasn't any sort of definition to the tracks. He did say that whatever it was must have been really big and super heavy. The tracks were about 12 to 14 inches in length, but then he went on to say that they estimated the creature must have been about at least 8 feet tall. Other than the tracks, there was nothing else that could be found. No smell, no fur, no additional tracks, nothing in the tree itself, just nothing. Afterwards, he said that they decided to just go back to the house and never really mentioned it to anyone or each other after that. My dad does love the paranormal, but he is a healthy skeptic when it comes to stuff like this. But that event, he says, made him become a huge believer in Bigfoot. And after having my own encounter, I've come to believe in something as well. I'm not saying that it's Bigfoot, but I do think that something is out there that hasn't been explained yet. The story takes place back in April of 2018. I live on Long Island and was in freshman year of high school. I was going through a tough time. Earlier in the week, my girlfriend broke up with me because of rumors that she heard about me, which I won't share here, but there was a lot of drama going around in my life at the time. Depression, broken hearts, typical high school stuff. My mum knew that I was down in the dumps, so one night she took me to get a new phone in the nearby mall. I had an iPhone 5 at the time, going on to an iPhone 8, so I needed a new one. But we were gone for about an hour, I would guess. We returned home with my dog greeting us. And let me tell you something about my dog. He's a short, stocky golden retriever who's never violent or vicious in any way. This is important for later as well. My dad was still at work, so it was my duty to take out the trash. I went through the front door, with my dog resting on the porch, and went to the side of my house to throw out the trash. When I was throwing out the bag, I look over to my neighbor's house, where I saw a guy dressed in all black, around 6 foot, walking out of their side door. Being a paranoid 14-year-old, I had a lot of red flags going off. Also, my neighbors and my neighborhood. I live in a safe neighborhood, but not 15 minutes away from walking distance. We live by a town that has high crime rates, ranging from muggings, drug dealings, and even murders from time to time. My neighbors have an older stepson who drag races a lot in the part of the town, so for some stupid reason, I wasn't in flight or fight mode yet because I was assuming that this could be one of his friends. Stupid of me, I know. Until there was another man, and then another one. There were 6 of these guys, all dressed in black, coming out of the house and from the backyard. It was then that I knew what was going on, so I tried walking away, acting like I saw nothing. When I was on my driveway, I saw 2 of the guys slowly walking towards me, and my blood instantly went cold. They were getting closer and closer before my dog came bolting off the porch, chasing 6 men down the street. And my dog came back. I was still standing on my driveway trying to process what I just saw. I went back inside with my mum asking what just happened. I told her what I saw with the 6 men coming out of the neighbor's house and heading towards me. And at that, she called the police and they came over to ask me questions. I described the 6 men as best as I could. The police told us that we weren't the first to experience this, as there were apparently 7 burglaries all over the town at the time, and I probably just witnessed them attempting to break in. I told the officers about 2 of the 6 guys walking toward me after I saw them, and they told me that since I saw them, they were trying to, I guess, stop witnesses. And that was basically a friendly way of them saying that the burglars were probably going to kill me since I saw what they were doing. As typical as this could get, the best they could do was a police report. I was always afraid of break-ins, but I never thought that I would ever experience one. To this day, I'm still surprised how my harmless golden retriever probably saved my life that night. And it showed me that no matter where you are in this world, this stuff can happen. 4 years have gone by, my family now owns a gun, and I'm currently training in kickboxing for self-defense. I don't know if I'll ever have to use it, but I guess it's better to be safe than sorry. My hometown is pretty small. So small, in fact, that I ran into this guy on 3 separate occasions. I remember being 8 or maybe 9 when this happened. So my younger brother, R, and I, we had stayed behind in the previous aisle playing with the small toy section. My mum had immediately called for us to follow her. R and I ran back to the shelf, threw our toys down, and ran as fast as we could down the aisle. We rounded the corner. He rounded it tighter than I did. I was able to keep running on. I, however, ended up running into this tall, big, burly man. He just stared down at me, and even at that age, I remember thinking that he looked like he wasn't completely there. He didn't talk to me, and the look on his face was just weird. In any case, I apologized and I ran back to my mum. For the rest of the time at the market, I remember constantly seeing him around too. He'd be at either end of the aisle, or he would sort of cross the market, always looking my way. And his stare just made my skin crawl. When we exited the market, he was standing at the door just staring at me. I've had so many nightmares of this market too. I can still remember the cold grey concrete flooring and the exact layout. It terrifies me just thinking about it. I had begged my mum for us to never go there, and I remember either always staying home if she went there, or she would avoid that market if I was with her. But I saw him twice after this. This time, I was 12. So my mum and I had went to a fast food restaurant that was in the shape of an L, except sort of flipped. The shorter part of the restaurant was the cashier part, and the longer was the seating. There were 2 entrances, one at the end of the sort of straight section and one right in the corner where the flat section meets the straight section. I hope that makes sense. But we had parked and entered at the top of the L. We sat down right near the door, and she said that she would go order the food. As she's walking away, I see the door at the other end swing open, and in walks the same man from the market. And he looked exactly the same as I remembered in my nightmares. He was headed to the cashier when he turned his head and looked down the aisle. He looked at me and immediately changed course. Now, he was headed straight to me. He took a seat 2 tables ahead of me. He sat so that we were directly facing each other. I grabbed my mum and I told her that I didn't want her to go. I told her that that was the man that I hated so much, the one who had terrified me when I was a little kid. We sat there for a few minutes while she calmed me down and told me that we would just quickly get up and head straight for the car. I remember I looked at her, and then I saw his head poke to the side of her, which means that he wanted me to see him. He had that same look on his face too. His eyes were wide open and he looked sort of slack-jawed. After that, we quickly got up and we left that place. The last time that I saw him, I'm not sure what age I was, to be honest. Maybe around 12 or so, maybe a little bit older. But we had emerged into the freeway as I looked to my left, and I see the man is driving. He looked over at me, immediately smiling when he saw my face. I told my mum that he was driving next to us, and she quickly got off the next turn, drove all around the town so that he wouldn't be able to keep up with us. At the time, I wasn't sure if he was following us, but asking my mum years later, she confirmed that he followed us all around the town for quite some time. I'm glad that I don't really remember much of that, but I think it was because my mum had told me to keep my head down. But I could still see him clear as day. I remember running into him. I remember the fear and the fright that he gave me. I think what scared me the most, though, about him was that he just looked really off. Like there was no line that he wouldn't cross to come and take me. He had no issue staring right into my eyes, in front of other people, letting me know that he wanted me. This happened way back in October of 2006. At that time, I was just a 19-year-old kid, always on the lookout for adventure. And one Friday night, after wrapping up my shift at McDonald's, I met up with some friends who suggested that we checked out this haunted location called White's Bridge. My one buddy, Brandon, said that he had recently learned about it and began telling us the legends associated with the 100-year-old wood-covered bridge. Never one to turn down a spooky experience, though. We all piled into my green Ford Taurus and headed out on our journey. Brandon gave directions, guiding me off the main road, and within minutes we were on the dirt back roads surrounded by woods and cornfields. Our only point of reference was a blinking cell tower off in the distance. We could tell that we were getting further from the city as our cell phones began slowly losing service. As we rode deeper and deeper into what legitimately felt like absolutely middle of nowhere, Brandon repeated the legend associated with the bridge. You see, back in the early 1900s, a local farmer discovered that his beloved wife had been cheating on him, and in a fit of rage, you get the story. After committing the act, the farmer left his home and wandered the dirt roads in a daze. He eventually came upon White's Bridge, where the realization of what he had done finally began to sink in, and he decided that he would rather not live than face the consequences of his actions. As far as I can tell now, the story is complete fiction, but at the time we totally believed it. So after a long and bumpy ride, Brendan instructed me to turn right on an off-road I wouldn't have even noticed was there, to be honest, had he not pointed it out. I took the turn, and there before us was White's Bridge. It looked like something straight out of a horror film, if I'm being honest. An old wood-covered bridge, aged by time, sitting alone above a river deep in the middle of nowhere. We parked the car on the side of the road, and we got out to explore. Immediately catching our eyes, though, was a scarecrow lying abandoned at the entrance to the bridge. My friend Mike, who was known as somewhat of a risk-taker, and a stupid one at that, picked up the scarecrow and then lit it on fire, of all things. The hay body burst up into a ball of flames, and Mike waved it around proudly next to the old dry wood bridge. Quickly realizing the risk, too, I told him to throw the stupid thing into the river and put it out, which thankfully he did. After making sure that there weren't any rogue embers that could ignite the bridge, Brandon suggested that we get back into the car and pull it onto the bridge. He explained that the legend was that if you parked your car in the middle of the bridge, put it into neutral, and then shut off the engine, the spirit of the dead farmer would push the vehicle forward to get it off the bridge. So naturally, we had to try this. We piled back in and did exactly as he said. We parked halfway across the rickety old bridge and killed the engine. We sat in the pitch black, saying nothing, waiting for something, anything to happen. The only sounds were the creaking of the bridge, the river flowing beneath us, and then footsteps. Suddenly, the back driver's door side opens and a woman abruptly enters the back seat, cramming in next to my two friends back there. She looked to be in her late 20s, early 30s, long, straight black hair, slim and wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. "I saw your fire signal for me," she said. What? Wait," I replied, totally freaked out and at a complete loss for words, to be honest. "I'm so glad you came. My boyfriend's car broke down that way. I need a ride back." My brain was doing its best to compute the situation. What? I'm sorry, but who are you?" I asked. "What are you doing out here?" "I told you," she responded curtly. "My boyfriend's car broke down over there. Can you please just give me a ride so I don't have to walk all the way back?" She was pointed ahead, towards a narrow road that forked off to the right on the other side of the bridge. My friend Mike, the scarecrow burner, and ever the gentleman, added, "I mean, if you need a place to stay, you're more than welcome to come crash at my place. I got plenty of drink and..." I interrupted him. "No, lady, listen, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. You just got in my car and this is all really weird. You could be an axe murderer for all I know, and I'm sorry, you've got to get out, alright?" She glared at me in the rearview mirror, and if looks could kill, I would have been done for. "But you signaled for me," she responded in an irritated tone. "We weren't signaling for you, alright? Just get out." She let out an angry sigh and got out, walking back in the direction from which she came and disappearing into the night. I started the engine right up and looked at my friends, and they all had looks of disbelief on their face. Without saying a word, I put the car in drive and slowly rolled forward and off the bridge. We needed to turn around and go back across the bridge to get back to where we had come from, and the only way to do that was to pull onto the side road that the woman said her boyfriend's car had broken down on and then reverse. As I pulled onto the side road, my headlights illuminated the 3 posted signs that I hadn't been able to see from the bridge: "No trespassing," "Private property," and "Do not enter." And looking up the road, there was suddenly no sign of the woman anywhere. And quite honestly, it was as if she just had literally vanished. I didn't want to stick around, so I backed up and crossed the bridge again, and from there began the journey home. We really didn't have much to say on the ride home, to be honest. I think we all just were equally stunned. Except for Mike, who asked if he knew anyone that would be awake at this hour that he could score some weed from. I visited White's Bridge a couple of times after that, but nothing of note ever happened in my subsequent visits. Sadly, some delinquents burned down the old White's Bridge some years ago, It was rebuilt, but from what I hear, it's just not the same as the original. I don't have any plans to go back and check it out, but it was an interesting experience, to say the least. For the past 4 years, I've worked as a funeral director and embalmer at 2 different locations in separate buildings. In my line of work, of course, the nature of the work would be unsettling to most, I suppose you could say, especially the aspect of the tasks completed on the descendants themselves. As an embalmer, I've performed some gruesome actions, all for the betterment of someone's loved one's appearance and their expectations during the viewing, during their visitation period. But I'm telling you all of this to set the stage that I'm definitely not scared easily from the unsettling, and I've had a rock-solid stomach that could handle any smell or sight that we come across that any embalmer will see at some point. As there are 2 locations, though, that I frequently visited for my work, I'll label them 1 and 2, just for simplicity's sake. So, the first location. Coming back from a death call at a hospital at 2 a.m. into a 130-year-old funeral home with a descendant in the back of the van seems creepy enough to most, but it's the reality that most people don't realize is a fairly common occurrence. My first major encounter happened sometime after I arrived to the funeral home and starting my normal embalming procedures. During the procedures, of course, I'm not paying extreme attention to my surroundings of the room, but I had noticed just a sort of nausea of chill that wasn't normal, as I'd embalmed many times before and never noticed anything like this. I just shrugged it off, though, and continued on. But after I had completed, I walked into a casket showroom, which is directly next to the embalming room, and flipped on the lights. And in the corner, next to the end of 2 caskets, was what I can only describe as a black mist that seemed to sort of dissipate into the corner of the room. Plain as day, in the fully lit room, I was absolutely rocked by this realization that me and this descendant were not alone in the funeral home. Someone or something had been watching me the entire time. The second occurrence was when I was leaving one night around 11 p.m. after a long day of death calls and funerals. Every evening when we leave, we would go from room to room and make sure every light is off to save on the electric bill. I had sat down in my car and looked up into one of the rooms on the second level, and I had noticed that I had left a lamp on. I decided to not go back in and get it in the morning. No big deal, right? Yeah, I wish. The specific room was the location manager's office, and it looked as if the light was emanating from the middle of the room. Just some context too, the lamp in question was originally owned by the location manager's wife who had passed, and also went through the same funeral home that we worked at. He had brought it from home to use there in his office because it was no longer needed at his house. And that next day, I went up there to check on the room and turn the lamp off. The only problem was that the lamp emanating the light the night before was sitting in the middle of his desk, not even plugged in. I was the first employee there that morning, and no one had been there during the night for any reason at all. Also, when seeing the lamp on the night before, I know the funeral home was empty because I was the last person to leave. Now, these 2 occurrences aren't alone, but they are probably some of the most notable, because I guess I just can't really explain them away. There are several hundred times that I felt watched or something seems to move in the corner of my eye. There's also been many times when I hear someone whisper hello or hey in my ear. There are so many that it's hard to keep when or how they happen straight, to be honest, but I guess that's just the baggage with the job. The second location, though, at this location I actually lived in the top funeral home for a period of like 6 to 8 months. It was because it was free room and board in a fully furnished apartment, and the ease of being able to just wake up and clock in the morning without even having to drive anywhere is a luxury that most people don't think about. But the first happening was subtle, but not a completely subtle moment, I suppose. A few weeks into my initial move into the apartment upstairs of the funeral home, I was sleeping in my room upstairs and was awoken by the sounds of the stairs creaking as if someone was walking up them. It was 1 a.m., and I knew that no one was there but me. Because usually when a death call happens, I know about them, because I'm called by my answering service to go and get them, I was sure that I was the only one there. At this point, I'm frozen in place, like who the heck would be there at this time of night without me knowing about it? All of the doors are locked to the funeral home, and so is my bedroom door. The freezing continues, though, until whatever it is outside my door comes to it and knocks on it twice. I say nothing, but after several moments of complete silence, the creaking starts again, but back down the stairwell. I sat totally still the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep at all. Thankfully, nothing else happened, but I was absolutely rattled by that experience. Whatever that was knew that I was up there. I didn't like that thought at all, too, but I had no other choice but to continue to live there because my financial position at the time, I couldn't really afford anything else. My second experience there was in the evening as well. I was eating a TV dinner in my kitchen there in the apartment. I looked up from my food and watched a doorknob turn, and the door opened as if someone just walked through and shut it back. I just sat there mouth agape and was totally flabbergasted. I was also there alone that night as well. There were no breezes or change in air pressure or anything that could account for the door's closure. I don't know what happened that night, but finally, and the most recent, yesterday I was sitting on the couch downstairs on break during the middle of the day. I was alone again. If there's nothing going on as far as funerals or arrangement conferences on the weekends, we keep the doors locked and the lights off. I rose from the couch and was walking into the main hall of the funeral home, and I noticed a man standing in the doors to the funeral chapel, and I said aloud, "Hey, you!" He didn't turn or say anything. He just walked away from me and turned the corner. I followed him into the chapel to try and get his attention. I rounded that same corner, and when I did, I found absolutely nothing. By this time, I was freaking out. The man was wearing a navy blue sort of pinstripe suit with a white-collared button-up, grey slicked back hair, and was about the same height as me, I think. He was an older fellow and was a little hunched over in the back. For reference, I'm 6'2". I immediately called the manager of the funeral home, though, same as the other location, and told him what had happened and described this man. And he told me that I had probably seen his old manager, who also lived in the apartment that I did currently several years ago. And it was at that moment that everything began to make some sense. When I was 14, I was asked to babysit my 3 younger cousins, aged 8, 4, and 1, in an extremely rural, mountainous part of Pennsylvania. My aunt and uncle, they had a wedding to go over an hour away and wouldn't be back until very late. Their house was situated on a steep mountainside. Their back deck had like a 15-foot drop onto a rocky hill below, leading down to a river. Their closest neighbours were about a half a mile away, I would guess. The closest main road was like a mile away, and at night there were no lights to be seen anywhere around them. Basically what I'm trying to say is that it was in the middle of nowhere, and you wouldn't have even known that it was there if you weren't, like, going to it, that is. You don't just accidentally end up here, that's for sure. Now, my aunt and uncle left us with some pizza and their cell phone number next to their landline. This was the early 2000s, and I didn't have a cell phone, but even if I did, I wouldn't get reception there anyway, and headed out. The baby was already asleep. The 4-year-old wasn't feeling well and was quietly watching TV in the living room as he dozed off, and the 8-year-old was playing Guitar Hero with me on the loft. The loft overlooked the living room to the left, where I could keep an eye on the 4-year-old, and there was a huge window that overlooked the driveway to the right. Now, this description of the driveway is an important detail to this story. The road that led to their house ran straight into their forked driveway. It was a dead-end road. The house was far off as you could go, pretty much. Go to the left driveway, there's a large open carport, and that's where my aunt and uncle, and anyone who ever visited, parked. The right driveway led down a very short but very steep hill to a large leveled out area, and ended up against the garage door that opened to the basement of the house. It was never used as a garage, but served as my uncle's man cave and where he spent most of his time. Right beside the garage door, a normal door with a window so that you could see right in was there, but this driveway was exclusively used by the kids as a play area because it was the only flat yard-like area on the property, and being on a mountainside, there isn't much room to safely play otherwise. No cars ever drove down there, ever. There are too many toys and bikes in the way anyway, and friends and family actually knew this. So, it was about 10 p.m, pitch black outside, no moon to illuminate the area either. My cousin and I were still playing Guitar Hero when headlights caught the corner of my eye. And it wasn't my aunt's minivan headlights. They were huge truck headlights with those roof lights that you often see on Jeeps or other off-road trucks. But not only that, the truck was going down the right driveway, the kids' play area. This was definitely not my aunt and uncle. This was, in fact, not anyone that they knew. Panic and dread began to fill my body at this. I was a teenage girl, alone in an isolated house on a mountain at night with 3 children in my care. In a terrified voice, I asked my cousin, "Who is that? Jake, do you know whose truck that is?" And then he looked panicked. No, I've never seen that truck before," he replied. I quickly ushered him downstairs, still unsure what to do, but the 2 little ones were sleeping down there and I wanted to make sure that they were safe. I checked on the baby, and then grabbed the phone to call 911, and then I started to hear the metal garage door being shaken violently. Now, as I said before, no one ever opened that garage door, so more panic began to fill me. I hear them try to open the door beside it, the metal doorknob jiggling. No one was actually knocking. It's not like they were checking to see if my uncle was down there. Plus, the lights were out. It was dark down there. They knew that nobody was down there. They were definitely breaking in. The door leading to the basement steps were right next to the phone, so I could clearly hear all of this going on as well. I quickly turned the little lock on the doorknob just in case they did make it into the basement. My heart was practically jumping out of my chest. I'm talking to the 911 dispatcher at this moment as my 8-year-old cousin clings to my arm. The operator is calm and trying to calm me, but I knew that it was going to be at least 30 minutes until a police officer could get up there, assuming they didn't totally get lost in this mountainside in the pitch dark. But I just kept thinking, we're dead. This is how I'm about to die. The operator asked for the number of my aunt and uncle left me so that she could have another dispatcher call them to let them know the situation. I turned around to grab the paper with the number on it, and to my absolute horror, I see a man peering in the large sliding glass door. A huge, burly, what had to be at least 6'4" man with a long scraggly red hair and red bushy beard. And what made it even worse was that he was grinning at me. Grinning in a way that still scares me to this day. Meanwhile, I had to have looked like a terrified deer in the headlights. I was shaking so hard that I could barely hold the phone now. There was a second man behind him that I couldn't see as well. I have no idea what he looked like, but he was equally as tall, but a bit more lanky than the larger man at the sliding glass door. I screamed, "They're here," and before the 911 operator could say anything, my 8-year-old cousin goes, "Mr. Jim?" His voice was very confused. It wasn't like my cousin was happy or even relieved to see him. I asked, "You know who that is?" But before my cousin could answer, I turned my attention to the man in the door, and I scream, "I'm on the phone with the police." I'm grateful that he didn't try that door because I don't think it was actually locked at the time. But the man stared at me hard for a moment, eyebrows furrowed, like deciding what he wanted to do next. But then he just backed away into the darkness. What seemed like an eternity later, I saw the truck lights back out of the driveway and then back down the road until they disappeared. I was still scared beyond belief, and so was my cousin. He had only met that guy a few times, an acquaintance of his dad apparently. It wasn't like it was a close family friend or anything, and obviously because, again, he went down the wrong driveway, and visitors never go that way, he didn't know the family very well. The 911 operator asked for a description of the man, then told me that they'd gotten in touch with my aunt and uncle and that they were on their way home. She stayed on the phone with me until a police officer showed up a bit later to make sure the men were gone, and they stayed with us until my aunt and uncle got home so that they could ask them some questions. Now, my uncle was absolutely furious. Not at me for calling them home early, but at this Mr. Jim guy. He muttered something like, "I'm going to mess this guy up." My aunt was mad at my uncle, who told him to tell Jim to never come back again. I didn't know at the time, but my uncle actually had a drug problem. I don't know what Mr. Jim or his accomplices were doing, or what would have been done if I wasn't on the phone with the police that night, but the grin, it definitely wasn't a friendly one. It was sinister. And again, he also had to have known my uncle was not there because the basement was dark. He would have seen through the windowed basement door. He had also tried lifting the garage door, something not even my uncle did. In other words, he intended to break into that basement. That much is clear to me. But apart from that, there's no other explanation. I never did babysit for them again, and I don't think I ever went back up there because not long after that, my aunt divorced my uncle and moved out. For reference, we live in a state infamous for human trafficking, and the event took place around 2 a.m. So my friend and I, both females, were driving down a road in the middle of nowhere, just to talk and clear our minds. And you know those roads out in the desert that stretch for miles with no lights, that get pitch black and a little bit spooky at night too? Well, it was one of those. We were already a little bit paranoid, given that we were both small females late at night in the middle of nowhere. If anything were to happen, no one would be around to see it. And after probably 15 minutes of driving out into this area, without passing a single vehicle, a black, either very large truck or SUV, I can't really remember despite it only being a couple of days ago, comes up in the distance. They had their high beams on, so they would have seen that we were two females alone passing us. And immediately after passing us, they pull off and stop for a second, which alarmed us a bit, and then pulled a U-turn, driving in our direction, which obviously alarmed us a little bit more. The street was just a long stretch of straight road continuing for miles, which means that there was no logical reason for them to have turned around like that. Based on the layout of the land, this is not the kind of place that you can make a wrong direction in. But regardless, if you're suspicious, it gets worse. So they speed up until they're directly behind us, blinding us with their lights, which scared us even more. And the next event made our stomachs drop and our breathing stop. They turned their lights off. We couldn't see them anymore, aside from the brief shadow of a vehicle if I really squinted into the dark, and to say that we were terrified was an understatement. All of the worst case scenarios were playing out in our heads. We had never been in this area before and we were now alone, but we didn't want to call the cops as they were notoriously unreliable. But we were in the middle of nowhere and we also had weed in the car. Despite this though, we felt safe knowing, despite unreliable, that we were in a vehicle. And as long as we didn't stop or get out, we should be safe. And so we did. For 30 minutes, but what felt like a lot longer than that, this vehicle followed us with the lights off, and we never passed a single other vehicle on the road, in fact. After driving back into civilization, finding a route that had no U-turns required, despite how much longer it would take, the vehicle got off once there were street lights and buildings in sight. In 2003, I dropped out, went hitchhiking west with a friend, ran out of money. after being homeless in Vancouver for a bit and burning every bridge possible, we somehow managed to make it to Nanaimo. Because I was a terrible person at the time, I managed to get thrown out of the last place that we had to stay, a house that was in a small community, a 3-hour walk outside of the city past Nickel Street. The house backed onto Weyerhaeuser logging land and was owned by a distant relative of my travelling partner. We had been working as roadies or groupies for this girl power punk band from Nanaimo called We've Been Had, and I had snuck one of them into the house and just, made a mess of everything. So my friend was angry at me. The band was also angry at me, and I'm certain 2 of them specifically wanted me dead. So to put a long story short, I'm homeless, broke, 3 hours outside of the city, and I turned towards the forest and walked into it. I had 2 bags of tomatoes, a bag of Wonder Bread, and some mayo. I also had a tent, a crank-powered lantern, a hitchhiker's backpack with an aluminium frame, and a bunch of weed. During the day, I would just wander around the forest. There was a massive open area about an hour's hike away from my camp where you could sit on a cliff face and see for miles around down into the forested valleys. It was a bit like nature's TV, I guess you could call it. I would go there in the morning, usually freezing my butt off, and the sun would warm the cliff face as it got closer to noon, and I would warm up with it and just sit, get stoned, and watch the crags for wildlife. It was a bizarre and foreign feeling to me, being thousands of kilometers away from anyone who cared about me back home. Canada really is immense. And then this new layer of isolation from everyone on the island after I messed everything up yet again. I felt almost monastic. Like if I were to perish in these woods, it would be a just punishment or some sort of atonement, I guess. Anyway, I ate the food that I had sparingly and did whatever drugs that I had with me. Eventually my friend forgave me enough to hike to my camp and visit, bringing stuff that he had stolen or busked for. Previously, we'd been working for a bit for this shady couple who made jewelry, and they were somehow connected to the local Hells Angels chapter. The whole community in the outskirts of this place was at the time, apparently. We would work buffing wheels all day, get a ton of metal flakes flung at us, no protection or anything. I remember being offered a job living in a grow house. It came with a Honda Civic, an Xbox apparently, and free cable. We turned it down though, and after that I started to feel a sense of hostility from the locals, which was another great addition to my now paranoia that I was living deep in the woods with. I would see a few animals every day while just sitting on the bluffs. I was too high and too far away to be noticed anyway. I saw bears and cougars, which made me nervous, I must admit. I had a knife, but it was small, so I made spears out of sturdy branches and spent a lot of sleepless nights clutching them in my tent like an idiot. It had been what felt like a month, I guess, or more maybe, when it first happened. So as I was about to head back to my camp with the last hour of sunlight, I saw a man standing on a rocky outcropping far across the crags. I could tell that he was heavily bared and shirtless, and that he had a bit of a red mark on him near the left hand, I think. Either blood or a swath of fabric or something, but not much else from the distance that I was at. The one thing that I did notice was that he had a log in his left hand. Not a walking stick or a staff, like a full-sized log. I watched him standing there, almost frozen, until his head moved ever so slightly, like he was looking towards me. And at that, I just booked it back to camp, sort of terrified. That night, I really didn't sleep much, and when I got the courage to hike back a few days later, I was relieved that there didn't seem to be any sign of him. That is, until 1 hour before sunset, when he showed up again. Same spot, same shirtless bearded guy dragging a full log in his left hand on a stone bluff 1,000 meters away. And something about the way that he moved, or didn't maybe, even from the distance that I was at, was deeply unsettling and I wasn't about to get the hills have eyed, so I walked back. I decided that I would leave the next morning, head back home, somehow. But what followed was two of the most surreal and terrifying nights of my entire life. You see, I returned back to camp late, and it was getting cloudy, so there was almost no light. I didn't have a flashlight, but I had a Coleman crank lantern that I would leave at camp. Again, like an idiot. This time I barely made it back before it was pitch black. I could see my camp very well, but something about it just felt off. That's when I noticed that the tent zipper was open, which could have easily been my fault, as I had done that before, but this time it was unzipped so much I had to fish around in the tent flaps to dig the zipper out. And when I finally got it free, I heard a scraping sound. Something definitely not natural, and it was coming from the direction of the animal trail. I leapt into my tent, freaking out. I grabbed the crank lantern and I started reefing on it, as I can still hear this deep, bassy scraping sound. I'm turning this crank and the lantern won't light up. I can still hear the scraping, but it also started to rain, and the raindrops on the tent sounded so loud for some reason that I'm getting sort of disorientated and more freaked out. I can't see anything, and now I also can't hear anything. The lantern too, which had worked every night since I'd been in this place, just all of a sudden refused to work. It was pitch black and raining. My tent at that time was already full of holes from nights spent using it like a sleeping bag on the cement highway shoulders. If you've ever hitched, then you'll understand this. And in the alleyways of Granville too, so it was also soaked on the inside. I remember just feeling so defeated and desperate in that moment that I just sort of sobbed and fell back into my gear with the flaps still slightly askew. It could have been exhaustion, drugs, or accumulated trauma, I don't know, but that night, I swear to you that I heard voices in the forest. Voices and the constant sound of that deep scraping. The voices, if they were speaking a language, I had no idea what it was, but I felt an accusatory and angry energy, as if the voices belonged to maybe demonic. I know, that sounds crazy, like something people summoned up that I had messed with. Something in my head convinced me that this was the case, and I began to spiral alone in the dark and the rain. I didn't sleep that night, obviously. I wanted to make it to the morning light so that I could make my way out of this place and back to the outskirts. But when morning came, it was raining so hard that I just couldn't leave. And by then I was so tired that I thought that I would rest for a couple of hours and see if the rain would pass. But when I woke up, it was almost dark again. And it was at this time that I really began to panic. I couldn't tell what hour of the day it was because of the clouds and stuff, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to risk hiking back through the muddy animal trail to the outskirts anyway. But I packed up my gear and decided that I would leave the tent, as it was basically ruined anyway. I started walking back, but it got dark a lot faster than I thought it would. It was also really difficult because of the rain, and all I had to wear were these terrible black sandals that were super heavy with mud now. And I must have got about 30 minutes from my camp when I heard the scraping sound again, coming from what I perceived to be further up the path. It was at this that I just completely lost it, freaked out, and began to run back towards my camp. It was dark again by the time that I got back, and I could hear the voices again. I zipped up the tent and spent the next few hours shivering in the puddle of water that had accumulated on the bottom of the tent. I was convinced that these voices and sounds were being manifested by my stress, but somehow, while I could convince my mind, I just couldn't convince my body that this was the case. I felt paralyzed, and I honestly felt like I was about to die. I must have fallen in and out of sleep though, because when I woke up again, it was pitch black outside, but the rain had stopped. And there was just a real eerie sense of a lack of sound. My chest felt clenched, like I was having a heart attack, but somehow I managed to unzip the tent front and look out. The Coleman lantern miraculously had started working, so I cranked it a bit more and I looked around. And man, it was so quiet. I've never been in such a quiet forest before, in fact. I remember it being so insanely quiet that I started questioning it, in fact. And there was a mist from all the rain as well, and it was just super, super eerie. But it was at this point that I noticed, sitting in front of my tent, was a long, thick log. One end of it was in a pool of water, and I could have sworn that it had stained the ground red with something. I ran, leaving a bunch of stuff behind, for hours, all the way to the highway in the early morning. I really don't remember who found me, but I ended up in the cop shop eventually, and at that point, honestly, it was like walking into heaven. 2 days later, I heard about a girl that I knew who was going east, and she offered me a ride. She was running from something too, probably a dude, but I don't know. We did Nanaimo to the prairies in like 24 hours non-stop, including the ferry ride as well, because at that point, I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. So last week, I was at home watching a movie. I was reclined in my chair, which faces a window that faces another building with a small amount of grass between them. I live in a basement apartment, so the windows are at ground level. They're about 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide. So I doze off and fall into a deep sleep. My dog is sleeping on my lap. I'll mention that my dog barks at any animal or wind rustling leaves outside this window. I know people ever walk by it, given its location, but occasionally a bird will come by it or something like that. I wake up abruptly from my sleep with an intense alertness. My eyes open wide quickly, like a sort of instinctual response. I remember immediately feeling like I was being watched. Simultaneously, I look straight at the window and I'm staring right at this face. Our eyes are locked on each other. I remember feeling nothing but extreme alertness and fear at this point, but also very calm, weirdly. I had this absolute knowing that it had been watching me sleep for a while. It felt more curious than threatening, I suppose. Whatever it was bizarre to say the least, and I just felt like I couldn't move, like I was hypnotized. Anyway, we stare at each other for like a solid 20 or so seconds. I'm just lying there, still unblinking. My mind was shifting through possibilities to rationalize logically what it could be. I wanted so badly to believe that it was just an animal, but its face was bare of fur with sort of human-colored skin. It was very small, no way it could have been human. It had to be the size of like a 1-year-old child, if that, by the size of its face. I couldn't see its body because it was dark outside, but my apartment was lit by my Christmas lights, and it looked like it was leaned in on its arms with its face as close to the window as possible. But what was particularly strange to me is that my dog wasn't barking. He just lied there, still with me. This is when I think, too, that I might have been having, like, sleep paralysis or something. I have sleep paralysis quite often, and this didn't feel like it. It felt more like a trance state. I felt connected to it somehow. I finally get the nerve to sit up and take a closer look and mumble, "What the?" And that's when it backs away. I remember my thought process being in slow motion and clear. I tell myself to listen closely to see if I can hear 4 legs or 2. It just gets up and runs away, and this is when my dog finally starts barking. That was when I knew for sure as well that I wasn't imagining it. I mean, I hear it run distinctly on 2 feet. It sounded really small, whatever it was. I could tell by the sound of its sort of gating walk that it was very small. And in the end, I just sat there confused, and my dog going crazy. I checked the time, and it's 4:47 in the morning. And guys, I have no idea what to think. It does correlate with one thing, though. You see, in late August, I started building a shrine or a temple type thing out in the woods at a large nature park. It was my favorite spot to go and meditate or practice my harmonica or write. It became an encompassing sort of spiritual ritual, I guess you could say, to go out there. The whole thing was a meditation type practice, and it's basically a big teepee made from dead tree trunks and branches, with a stacked stick circle inside of it. I had worked tirelessly out there, being in a kind of union with nature in my mind as I built it. I meditated and carried the meditation out with action. I remember one night too, at like 1 a.m, a friend and I were sitting out there. We were in the middle of a conversation when my friend's face turns into a sort of panic worry. I stop talking and can hear footsteps coming towards us. It was already loud and distinct enough, as if close to us, I think. But we sat and listened for a long time as it kept walking closer, but never actually got to us, which was weird. We decided to leave though, and she really doesn't like talking about it because of the feeling of the energy and air as we acknowledged it. Anyways, someone totally destroyed my shrine in October, and I just left it as it is. It sort of crushed me a bit, and I would often visit the ruins a bit heartbroken. But to wrap this tangent up, the day that this happened, the creature watching me sleep that is, was the same day that I went out there and suddenly felt a strong urge to rebuild it. I cleared everything and started again, and after a few hours I came home and fell asleep, and then all of this happened. I don't know if any of it means anything, but what do you guys think? This happened when I was about 14 or 15. I'm 19 now. I was in my house's basement playing PlayStation absentmindedly late into the night like I did often at the time. Being up till like 3 or 4 in the morning was not unusual for me at this time. How my house is structured too is that it has a front door but also a second set of front doors if you go down the driveway. The basement is by these second doors too. So, as I was getting ready to log off for the night, I heard my dog started going crazy from upstairs. They sometimes bark at nothing, a car passing in the night or too much wind whipping past their window or something. However, as someone who listened to too many scary stories, that was more than enough for me to go and check it out. So I went upstairs and was about to go straight to my room when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the window. I looked through my window to the front yard, but I couldn't see anything. And suddenly I heard my dad yell in a voice lower than his own, "Hey, can I help you?" This is what set me into pure adrenaline mode. I stood frozen, staring out of the window as my ears strained to hear the guy's response. I still got nothing before my dad continued, "Sorry, you have the wrong house, get off the property." And it was at this point that whoever this person was comes into sightline. It was a man wearing a white sleeveless shirt and cargo pants, and I watched as he walked off our front path and onto the street, and then back onto the path, and he was seemingly unsure of where to go or what to do, I think. It was at this point that I realized with utter dread I didn't lock the downstairs front door. I finally break my frozen spell and run back down the stairs and lock the front door. I take a deep breath and start back towards the stairs when I hear it. The door handle jiggling. I don't even look back. I just book it up the stairs and into my parents' room. My dad had already called the cops. They came about half an hour later and seemingly picked up the guy from an empty house down the street that was in the process of being sold. And the following day, when my dad was checking the newspaper, it told of an escaped convict from the max security prison here. Some sort of mix-up was made and they let the wrong person out apparently. They caught him luckily enough, but didn't detail where. But it was obvious based on some of the information within the article that this was the dude that we saw that night. And that is how I both forgot and remembered my way through a very creepy experience.